On today's show, continuing the player review series, for one sir, just announced Rookie of the Year finalist Jackson Merrill, a magical season, possibly the greatest young season that a Padres player has ever had. Young season. That sounds a little bit weird, but whatever. Going over the good, bad, the fantastic, the extremely fantastic, and projecting forward to the future for our guy, Jackson. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Padres, your daily San Diego Padres podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Padres podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day for Tuesday, November 12th. As always, I'm your host with sometimes, occasionally, but certainly not always the most, Javier Reyes. You can check out my Twitter account, /X, on Twitter, /X, at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO, or you could also check out just updates for the show at LO_Padres. I'm also on Blue Sky, whatever, just look me up, Javier Reyes, whatever. I don't know if that thing's going to take off or not, so I'm just made an account if you guys are curious. And also, if you want to check out my other baseball related work, I'm going to be writing stuff over the off season over at Just Baseball, including working on the newsletter. I help to edit that and will be contributing to it as well. And then also my other podcast, Baseball versus the World, going forward. When that starts ramping up, I'll let you know. Today's episode, guys, though, we are recapping the season that Jackson Merrill had in honor of the Rookie of the Year finalist announcement. There was a bunch of announcements made. Manager of the Year as well, by the way, Mike Schilt. We'll talk about him a little bit more tomorrow. Today's episode was supposed to be me talking with my buddy Miller Thomas of Locked On Diamondbacks about, super teams and the biggest free agent targets and some of the award announcements and whatnot. But unfortunately, his power just died. So that's going to be tomorrow's episode. But I think that this fits anyway. I wanted to talk about Merrill. And with the announcement that he's one of the finalists, I felt that it was appropriate. So it's going to be a lot of fun. And usually this is a series where I do the good and the bad. This is basically all good. One of my favorite single seasons that a Padre has had as long as I've been hosting this podcast. And we're going to explain exactly why, guys. But first, let me just tell you today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know about Jackson Merrill. He was the superstar, top 10 prospect and whatnot for a while. And it's funny that when he was originally drafted, and people might forget this, there was a little bit of a another shortstop kind of thing. That's kind of what the Padres had been doing. And when you look at what they needed, you were like, well, they have Kim and they have this Tatis guy. So them drafting a shortstop, I think, made some people perk their ears up a little bit. Of course, that didn't end up mattering. And I think that one of the most overrated things that I've learned, especially ever since covering this podcast, is that the position stuff doesn't really matter as much when you're drafting in baseball, aside from pitcher and hitter, and maybe catcher a little bit, but otherwise it's kind of, outfield, infielder, start pitcher, catcher. Everything else is just kind of, it can be a lot more malleable, I think, that people realized. But it was a draft pick that I don't think a lot of people were expecting. And I think that was what was so interesting, is when you follow the Padres, they like to take these really young players and just kind of take these high upside guys, for lack of a better explanation for it, instead of just guys that seem like they'll acclimate to Major League hitting. And it worked big time. And you have to remember that in the Juan Soto trade, one thing that was so key is, while they did give up Abrams, they gave up James Wood, they gave up Susanna, they gave up Mackenzie Gore. 3 of the 4 of those players are at least quality MLB players. I know that Abrams had a bad second half, and we're wondering exactly what's going on with him and his little off-field gambling incident. Not that he got caught gambling on games or anything like that, but that he was just late to practice because he was up at the casino until 7 a.m. or whatever. That was weird, but he's still a quality, he's a major league starter. James Wood is a super high upside guy that looks like he could be a star potentially as soon as next year. And Mackenzie Gore is at minimum maybe a number 3 to maybe high 4 kind of starting pitcher. So they did give up a lot of young controllable assets for Juan Soto. And we've talked about that ad nauseum, right? I'm not going to talk about it in this episode, but they were really key and really intent on keeping Jackson Merrill. And it very, very clearly was the right decision, because Jackson Merrill had a season for the ages, folks. I mean, this is my God. I mean, if I had to just talk, let's start from the beginning with the good. holy crap, he's a rookie. Man, this was a rookie player. And what he did this year is put together one of the finest seasons that we've ever seen from someone at this age, at least at minimum, in terms of Padres players, right? He finished the season with 24 home runs, 16 stolen bases, a slash line of 292, 326, 500, a WRC plus of 130, and a final wins above replacement mark, according to Fangraphs, of 5.3. I mean, need I say more? He finished 15th in wins above replacement according to Fangraphs among all position players, and if you want to just limit it to the National League, he was 7th. I mean, Lord almighty, everybody. This was just an absolutely insane season from our guy. And it's kind of funny that, like, basically he was almost bar none, basically, in terms of totality. He had the most wins above replacement among all National League outfielders this year. And that's why, second point, he finished literally as a top 3 finalist for Rookie of the Year, as we said at the top of this show, with Jackson Merrill and Paul Skeens as the other nominees. Some people were a little bit surprised that Mason Miller didn't get a nomination. Whatever, me personally, you're a reliever, man. It's not nearly as impressive. But with Jackson Merrill, it's also fun to point out, speaking of Churio, that he wasn't even the highest ceiling prospect for this year. I think a lot of people, you had Jackson Holiday, you had Jackson Churio, you had a bunch of other rookies that I think had a lot more higher expectations. Paul Skeens, even, I think, heading into the season, had a lot more expectations. But he exceeded basically everything for the Padres this season. And he had one of the best young seasons we've seen. And I think it's cool to look at, those numbers that I just gave you and compare them a little bit to Tatis, right? Fernando Tatis Jr. Was the other player, obviously, that had one of the best young seasons we've ever seen, right? Especially for the Padres. In his season, though, he put up 3 wins above replacement, and he had his final slash line of 317, 379, 590 with 22 home runs and 16 stolen bases. Now, here's the thing. I don't think necessarily that Jackson Merrill, as a player, was better than Fernando Tatis Jr., but he had the better season because, quite simply, he played more games. It's just as simple as that. Tatis only played 84 games that year, and then Jackson Merrill played 156 games. So that's basically what it comes down to. So no, I don't think that Jackson Merrill was a better player than Tatis at this age. It's just that he played more, and that still matters. Don't get me wrong. But Tatis was really, truly unbelievable. I mean, 151 WRC plus as a 20-year-old is just absolutely stupid. Like, that's just absolutely insane. But even so, with Jackson Merrill, you saw that this was a player that just showed up time and time again. He felt like on a team, and this would be kind of my third point I want to bring up before we head to the break, on a team that has so many big personalities or just famous players and players with a huge stature and whatnot, from the Yu Darvishes and the Joe Musgroves to even, obviously a Tatis, and then a Xander Bogaerts, Manny Machado, Jake Cronenworth, Hassan Kim, and all these sort of players, for him to be, and I think it really started happening towards the second half of the season, where you really started to feel it, especially, and we're going to talk about that more, specifically his second half in a second, but I feel like once you got to the second half, didn't it feel like he was kind of the emotional leader of this team, at least to us, the fans? I'm not talking about inside the clubhouse. I imagine that was still the usual suspects, right? But when you get to the second half, and when you start seeing his energy, I think the way to throw it out there is not necessarily that he was the leader of the team, but he was the heart and, like, the one that stood out, it felt like, the most when you watch the Padres play. Like, he looked so activated at all times, and I think it was contagious. I think it was great having a young guy. I think that Tatis and him, obviously playing, playing center field and right field respectively, like, it just feels like those two played off each other with their energy. And I know that those aren't things that you can measure with stats, but it really felt true. It was just another thing that added on to his legend. And we're going to continue adding on and talking about all the good from Jackson Merrill's season in just a second, guys. But first, I must talk to you about one of our sponsors. That is the classic, the inevitable, folks, the inevitable Game Time. And they're fantastic. We love Game Time very, very much. Here's the thing. MLB playoffs, obviously done. But guess what? We've got the NBA regular season. We've got the NFL regular season. We've got the NHL regular season. We've got all sorts of things. And with Game Time, it is an authorized ticket marketplace, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. And prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down. Check that out. The closer you get to first pitch, guys, they have all these different filters that will show you only the best deals possible, and you can check them out. They show you views from your seats. They have event cancellation protection. They have all sorts of things. They have zone deals, so you just pick a zone, they pick a seat for you, and you get a discount, that type of thing. Really, really good stuff all the way around for whatever it is. And by the way, not just sports, concerts, comedy, theater, whatever you want, guys. Game Time has you covered. So whenever you're you get an unexpected extra time, maybe some plans get canceled and you're like, oh wait, let me go run over to the Bronx and watch the Yankees or whatever. You can do that with Game Time, guys. And check this out. If you download the app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB, you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. But again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed with Game Time. And just like that, everybody, we are back here on the Locked On Padres podcast, thriving and vibing, talking about Jackson Merrill. And let's talk. Let's continue all the good. No time to waste. One of the things about Jackson Merrill that was expected was his hit tool and the fact that he was really good at making contact. And you saw that this year, right? This is a guy who did not have a high K rate. In fact, it was just 17%, which is excellent. His strikeout rate was in the 78th percentile among all qualified players, and his whiff rate, 73rd percentile. So this was a guy who just was so good at making contact, and that was expected to a degree. I think that everybody kind of said, this guy's going to be good at that, right? Zone contact percentage was at 85.8%, and don't get me wrong, he did chase every now and then, but he just always, he put together productive at-bats. Considering that he was a rookie at 21 years old, he always managed to put together really, really good at-bats. And I think that that was what was so exciting about him, and he just never looked like he was overwhelmed by things. He hit off-speed pitches very well. He hit fastballs very well. And that was really exciting. And I think that when it comes to Jackson Merrill's overall abilities, you really saw the big stuff happened in the second half. In the first half, he was still a good player. Don't get me wrong. 109 WRC plus. He'd be a little bit up and down, but overall, he was still a good player who provided good defense, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then the second half is when it really, really clicked. And this was the surprising part. Not the contact stuff. Anyone could have said, yeah, I could see him hitting, 10 home runs and having like a 280 batting average and just be a little bit of a pest running the base pass and all that sort of stuff. But I don't think anyone saw what happened in the second half. His isolated power number went from 157 to 283. That's insane. Good for a 159 WRC plus. He hit the 25 home runs, and it was astounding, right? That was not expected. That was something that we were hoping he'd be able to do, that he was going to lift the ball more in the second season or third season and beyond. But instead, he did it immediately, which is why Jackson Merrill had such an amazing season, as he tapped into power with his great ability to already make contact at such a young age, right? So that's what was really, really exciting about him, especially in that second half. And speaking of that second half, you know what else was really cool about him? The clutch moments. It was great. 6 game-tying or go-ahead home runs in the 8th or later. That was the most ever by a 21-year-old player or younger. And the one that's there's so many, right? Like you had the ones against the Marlins when the Padres offense inexplicably just died. That was like the best phase of the season when the Padres simply just did not lose. And then you had Jackson Merrill just single-handedly saving them. That was a weird series where they just underplayed the Marlins and made it close. But 6 game time or go-ahead home runs in the 8th inning or later. It was just sensational. I really enjoyed the Mason Miller one, only because Mason Miller, who I just mentioned before, did not get a Rookie of the Year nomination, that he did hit a walk-off off of Mason Miller, who at the time was like the best closer, best relief pitcher in baseball. Basically, nobody could touch him. So that was awesome. Down the right field line. That was amazing. Had a lot of clutch moments. And also, speaking of clutch moments, had them in the playoffs too, right? Like he also produced in the postseason. He basically just always showed up. And for a player at 21 years old, it's just it's kind of unheard of for you to be able to produce at this level, like genuinely. And I think that the Padres, you kind of look at just their history, right? I mentioned CJ Abrams in the first segment. I mentioned James Wood. I mentioned those guys. They haven't always been so good at really getting the best out of their prospects. It seems like they often rush them. And in the case of Jackson Merrill, that was another scare, right? And it turns out it was not something that they had to be worried about. And it's just, I can't stop like gushing about this guy. It was just one of the best seasons I had seen from a player in a long time. And there's more reasons for it. I think that while this doesn't necessarily have to do with the player in a vacuum, it definitely doesn't have to do with the player in a vacuum. But I think that it is still important the context in which Jackson Merrill did all this. It cannot be emphasized enough how crucial this season was for the Padres being as good as they were. Don't get me wrong, they had a lot of good stuff go their way. Michael King, who we're going to do a player review of in the future, you had him go well. You had the trade for Dylan Cease. You had the trade for Luis Arraez. You had Jake Cronenworth at least getting a little bit better. You had Jackson Profar being the starting left fielder in the All-Star game, and you got him for like literally $1 million. You had the Donovan Solano signing. You had just everything, frankly, from the Juan Soto trade. The fact that you got Higashioka out of that too, right? Don't get me wrong, it wasn't the only reason the Padres are good this year. But heading into the season, it cannot be emphasized enough how much they needed Jackson Merrill to be good. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, the outfield depth wasn't great, right? And don't get me wrong, that's heading into the season. We didn't know that Profar was going to be this good. But outside Jackson Merrill, it was basically, you were looking at a Jose Azocar. And that's kind of it. You know, because they also sent Trent Grisham away, which was fine. He actually, it's funny, I will cop to it. I thought Trent Grisham was going to be low-key, like kind of okay for the Yankees this year, and I thought he was going to take advantage of that stadium and just be a power hitter who hit like 230, right, and had like a 310 on base. I really like had a feeling that might happen. Did not happen. The guy can't hit, and we weren't wrong. Don't worry, everybody. Every now and then, don't freak out. Sometimes the bad players of the Padres really are just bad, and it's not necessarily just their fault. And Trent Grisham is one of those things. But they had been starting Trent Grisham for like 3 seasons straight with basically no other backup. So you move in here and you say, on top of the lack of the outfield depth, this guy, Jackson Merrill, this man, this mythical beast, he had never played the outfield before. So if you take all that into consideration, and then by the way, the Padres, I was just mentioning that they haven't always had the best, production from their young players for a variety of reasons that we have discussed on this show countless times before. But you really needed, like I said, you needed Merrill because of the lack of the outfield depth. You needed Merrill because, quite simply, you need controllable, young, quality, controllable players. This team has a payroll through the roof. And for them to now have a player that they don't have to have extended and going into their yearly salary cap and their yearly, I should say, payroll, that makes a difference. I know we always talk about spend more, spend more. The Padres are one of those teams where I can't necessarily yell at the ownership for saying spend more because they are spending a lot. There are other teams that are really good that don't. The Padres are not one of those teams. And that's one of the reasons that the Juan Soto trade was so fascinating, is because it was one of the rare instances of not just, I mean, originally also, by the way, the Nationals trade, it was like they genuinely got worthwhile return, the Nationals. They did not get it for Scherzer and Trey Turner, which I'll never forget. But when it comes to trading away superstars, it's almost always viewed, when you look at the history of baseball, as, they're salary dumping. They don't want to pay this guy too much money, so they're getting rid of him. And while that is part of it, the Padres also had a huge payroll, so it actually was like the rare instance in which a superstar was traded for somewhat good reasons. And then the trade turned out to be pretty good, at least for this past season, right? So they really needed, because of that, the Soto trading away Soto is evidence of that. They needed someone to be very good that they don't have to pay $25 million a year. And that's not a shot to players asking for that much money. They should absolutely get that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying they needed some flexibility. They needed a young player that was going to be super duper 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 good, right? Because everybody on this team who's a star player has been extended. Everyone else who's a major player aspect on this team has been extended, with the exception of obviously your Kims and your Profars, right? We'll see how they go. Tanner Scott's leaving in free agency probably. I get it. But I'm just saying overall, they really needed that, especially for a position where they've been trying out Trent Grisham for years. And for them to get that out of a player who had never played center field, that's the craziest thing. Right? He had never played center field before. So you stuck him in there and you were just hoping for the best. And you said, Jerks and Profar, hopefully you're good at left field. And Tatis coming off the platinum glove, you're great. But that was huge, man. And then not to mention Manny Machado for the first, 2 months of the season. He was injured and battling, right? You didn't know what you were getting from Xander Bogaerts. So that's the other thing. On top of the fact that they needed a young, controllable player and someone to be good in center field and just be a quality player for them, it wasn't a guarantee that the other players on this team stepped up, right? I think that Machado was expected to a degree, but he was still hurt for those first 2 months. You were really worried about guys like Xander Bogaerts and Jake Cronenworth, right? And both of those players still, I think, dare I say, still have some concerns going forward. And then you were still saying, well, we love Tatis, but how much do you want to put on him? Do you need an MVP season for him for this team to be good? And I understand that other things ended up coming true. I get that. But he was just paramount to this team's success. And part of me is that's why I'm a little bit favoring him in the Rookie of the Year race. I don't mind the Skeens thing. I think it's fine, frankly, if you vote for Paul Skeens. I think it's more than deserved. He arguably had one of the best young pitching performances ever, like literally ever. But Jackson Merrill was up there, man. Jackson Merrill's close to your Ken Griffey Jr. type of debut seasons, right? Like he was that good. Am I making that up, by the way? I think Ken Griffey Jr. had like let me see, according to Fangraphs, let me just pull this up really quickly. Ken Griffey Jr.'s age 21 season, he had a 6.9 F4. Okay, but he debuted at, okay, so maybe not quite as good, but you guys get my point, right? This was that good. If you count his second season, it was very close to Merrill's, right? But overall, I think that's probably the biggest reason for why Jackson Merrill, I think that this season was such a huge plus, and why I'm going to be grading it very highly at the end of this podcast is because they desperately needed him. And a lot of things were not guaranteed, from the power surge, from moving to center field and being good there. It just wasn't a guarantee. We're going to continue talking about it and then talk a little bit about the future and giving the letter grade and what's to be expected kind of from this going forward. Should they extend him? All that sort of stuff in just a second, guys. But first, I need to talk to you about another one of our sponsors, ladies and gentlemen. You know them. They're the good old folks who have been here for a long time, and that is FanDuel, ladies and gentlemen. And here's the thing. If you want to start your NFL betting season with a big return, you can on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. It's fantastic over at FanDuel, guys. We love them very, very much. Very, very, very much, guys. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's right, everybody. FanDuel.com, $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. And just like that, everybody, we are back thriving and vibing into the final segment of this Locked On Padres podcast. Quick reminder, everybody, to check me out on Twitter /X at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO, and at LO_Padres, where you can keep up with the updates on my life and what have you, whatever you choose. And if you're curious, this little squirrel guy, his name is Conker, and he's in a good mood. He's in a good mood in his little throne chair. Okay. Here's the thing with Jackson Merrill, lastly, is defensively he was good. He wasn't just an adequate defender, and I always felt like, I understand Trent Grisham was a good defensive player. I get it. I understand that. But there were times when I'm like, we sure he's great though? Like, are we sure that he's like a great defensive player? One thing's for sure is I still don't understand how they just gave him a blank check to play there as much as they did. But with our guy, Jackson Merrill, I think that one of the things with Merrill, on top of not having played there before, the Padres have had really good history, I think, and I think a lot of teams have had decent history of drafting shortstops and saying, you know what, this is the most athletic position usually. And if there's a position you can hope for someone to be able to transition and play a new position, depending on how your Major League Ball club kind of shapes out, it is the shortstop prospect. And it worked brilliantly. Jackson Merrill finished with 11 outs above average, and that was in the 97th percentile among all qualified defenders. So not only was he adequate, not only was he good, he was exemplary. So good, in fact, that he's probably going to be nominated for a Gold Glove award. I know, that's nuts. I can't believe it. He was 18th in overall outs above average among all qualified players, and in terms of outfielders, he was 8th. With, in terms of National Leaguers, speaking of Gold Glove, the only ones with higher marks were Pete Crow Armstrong of the Chicago Cubs, Brenton Doyle of the Colorado Rockies, and then Jacob Young of the Washington Nationals. So, yeah, pretty good company to be in. So maybe he'll be a finalist, maybe he won't be. But bottom line is he made amazing catches all the time. I remember when he made that leaping robbery of Shohei Ohtani in the regular season when he robbed them of a double in that game. They ended up making a comeback, right? So Jackson Merrill, for him to be that good defensively, was such a huge plus for his team, and he didn't even play the position before. I would think, I might just say, maybe he deserves at least a nomination for that fact only. The fact that he had never played this position before. Usually voters, and with the exception of Gold Glove though, so maybe he does have a chance. Usually voters are very, I've noticed like very stringent, strictly stats, I think I should say, with voters sometimes, except for Gold Glove. I mean, Juan Soto's been nominated like multiple times. Like, he's just not a good defensive player. He keeps getting nominated. So I'm wondering, I would make that case to say, I think he deserves a nomination for the fact that he never played this position before this year. And for him to be this good defensively, I think that matters. And I think that should count towards your season and how great your season was. I really do. And let me know if you guys disagree in the comments. I understand that those 3 other players had better defensive seasons, but I'm just saying, never played it before, and those are the numbers you're putting up. I think that should count. I think that should count towards something. I think a little bit of a narrative bump is fine when we're doing awards sometimes in baseball, even if it's not like football and basketball necessarily. But anyway, so that's basically it for all the positives, guys. He had a power surge. He's a friggin' rookie, and he put up these numbers. His overall stat line, the fact that he tapped into the power, his second half, his clutch, the fact that he had all of those game-tying home runs in the 8th inning or later, his defensive abilities, and then lastly, the fact that the Padres desperately needed him to be a quality player, and he exceeded that in every level, and it's going to be crucial for the team going forward that they have a young, controllable, like, forget high quality, stud quality of a player, right? Let's talk a tiny bit about the negatives, because I don't want to LARP on this too much, right? I just want to kind of get into the grade. But the negatives would be low walk rate. He was in the 8th percentile among all players, which is very bad. And then a high chase rate in the 14th percentile. That is probably one of the reasons why I love bringing up WOBA and ex-WOBA. That's probably why his weighted on base is a little bit lower than his expected weighted on base, 352 versus 376. Now here's the thing, the 352 is still excellent, and remember, this is still a rookie player, so while projecting going forward, you might say, all right, is he going to be that good defensively again? Is he going to be able to hit for that much power despite not walking? Are teams going to figure him out? Those are all very valid concerns, and the sophomore slump is absolutely possible, right? But you could just as easily say, well, he's going to figure out some things. He's going to get better in the second season. So I don't want to fully kill him for that. But it is still worth pointing out that, hey, the guy doesn't walk. And usually that doesn't always age well if you aren't a player. So it is a thing to look into, I think, going forward. Don't get me wrong. His ability to always make contact makes up for the fact that he doesn't have a high walk rate, right? So if there is a player that didn't have a high walk rate, but just always did damage with whatever they swung at, that would make you more concerned, because it shows that, well, you're not going to be able to always do that if you're not taking walks, right? On a small level, look at Luis Campusano, right? I know it's completely different, but just as a little bit of example to get across what I'm saying is, Luis Campusano would never walk. So yeah, he never struck out, but he would never walk, so you were always hoping that whenever he made contact, it would be good. Now, the difference, of course, is that Jackson Merrill's quality of contact is infinitely better than Luis Campusano. He has infinitely more power than Luis Campusano, so I understand that. But it's just something to look forward in terms of the long future, and be like, when you start losing it a little bit, when you have more major league games on your belt, and kind of the tiring of a long season and a long career, could it be possible that a low walk rate affects you? Sure. But I think these are minor things. They're just worth bringing up because overall the season was damn near a complete season, which is why I'm giving Jackson Merrill an A+. This is the first time I've ever given an A+ for an individual season when doing my player reviews since I've been doing this podcast. I'm dead serious. I didn't even give Tatis in 2021 an A+. Why? Because he wasn't very good defensively and he missed a lot of time. I didn't even give Manny Machado an A+, if I'm not mistaken, because his defensive stuff wasn't amazing in 2022, right? I think. I'm pretty sure. He got like an A, very close to an A+, but this is my first A+ for all the reasons, because you have to take into account the context. That's what puts him over the top for me, is the context of the team, is the context of the age and all of that stuff. And it was just incredible, and he gave us so many good memories too. We're going to be talking about those memories on a future podcast when we talk about the best, ranking the 10 best moments and magical, serene, blissful joy that the Padres gave us in 2024. We will talk about that in the future. And speaking of the future, should the Padres extend Jackson Merrill? I am a very strong no at the moment. Unless we get something like what the Braves did with Michael Harris, he signed an 8-year, $72 million extension. Like, that's really good. Only $8 million a year, and then it rises to $10 million, and then $12 million in the final couple of years, and then $20 million in the last year. But that's fine at age 31. Unless you get a deal like that, I'm not interested in extending Jackson Merrill right now, just because it's good. You're spending so much money. This isn't like those other teams. We're not like other teams, guys. It's okay. So to me, having that versatility is great. I think for Jackson Merrill, he's going to go up in arbitration, I imagine. And based on the Padres' recent history, they will immediately give him whatever he asks for, whatever number he puts forward, right? I think that there's a good connection there. But just in terms of keeping this team together, remember, Darvish salary, Machado, Fernando Tatis Jr., those numbers are going to go up. So it's important to keep as many advantages as you have. This is not a team that abuses the arbitration system nearly as much as any other team. I'm not happy about it, but unfortunately, just as someone who's just talking about what's good for the team, that is kind of where we're at. So I'm a little bit against it. I wouldn't be upset if they did some sort of 8 years, 95 million, whatever it is type of deal. I'm just saying that it's a good reason not to, right? And then also, not to mention, it's still just his first season, so we don't want to freak out. Michael Harris has not been incredible for the Braves. I still think he's got a lot of talent. I still think he's going to be a good player. But it's also worth noting that he hasn't been, as shut down as he was that first rookie season. So anything can happen going forward, but it's an A+ for Jackson Merrill. I could not be more happy. I wish I could just do this podcast over and over again, because talking about him is the best. Just really unbelievable stuff. And this is why every now and then you hold on to prospects, man. Not always, but having some of those lottery tickets, let's call them, in your farm system that could change the outlook and perspective of everything. Sometimes you get Jackson Merrill, guys. And with that all being said, that about does it for today's edition of the Locked On Padres podcast, the only pod that may be better than the Padres themselves. Remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Follow me on Twitter, again, at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO, or at @LO_Padres. Going to be talking with Miller Thomas on tomorrow's podcast about all sorts of things, including awards, our top free agents that we're really interested in, all sorts of stuff. That'll be a lot of fun. We'll take a little bit of a break from just hearing from me. I know you guys are sick of me. Everyone's sick of me. I'm sick of me. So don't worry, we have that coming up on tomorrow's show. But until next time, stay safe and, of course, stay faithful. My Friar Faithful homies, take care.